Before we close off the Siman, there are 2 points that I mentioned in the course of the Siman that I'd like to just clarify. The first point is on the Shitta of Beis Shammai. I explained that Beis Shammai held there is a Gzeira that the Chachamim imposed on people who leave the table without reciting Birkas HaMazon, even if they forgot, in order to educate people to return and just to stay at the table before they leave. And the reason the Chachamim imposed this Gzeira is because the mitzvah of Birkas HaMazon is only for someone who experiences not only a physical sensation of satisfaction, v'savata, but also a mental satisfaction, v'savata, in the sense that when one has finished eating and one feels full and one feels satisfied and that one's hunger has been stayed and one has that momentary feeling of enjoyment, that is also a type of hana, a mental hana, and that is why when the Torah requires Birkas HaMazon. But if one gets up and leaves the table after experiencing this mental hana, then one forgets about it. And from that point onwards, one has lost the opportunity to fulfill the mitzvah of Birkas HaMazon from the Torah, because one is no longer experiencing the prerequisite, the savata, mental satisfaction. And so Beis Shammai imposed, or they held that the Chachamim initiated a Gzeira that people should return back to the table and always recite Birkas HaMazon where they ate, so that they will never come to neglect the mitzvah d'oraisa. So that's the way that we explained the Shitta of Beis Shammai. Now this would raise certain queries then, because it would mean that if a person leaves the table according to Beis Shammai, and then they return back to the table and they recite Birkas HaMazon, then they are at most fulfilling a mitzvah d'Rabbanan, because they have lost the mitzvah d'oraisa by leaving the table. And we use this to explain the strange shitta of the Tur, because the Tur held that if you leave the table b'mezid, if you intentionally get up from the table without benching, then according to Beis Shammai, if you did bench in another location, you have to bench again, go back to the table and bench again. And that could only be if benching is d'Rabbanan at this stage, because if it was d'oraisa, then it wouldn't matter where one recites Birkas HaMazon, one has fulfilled the mitzvah. So obviously, the mitzvah at this point, when one leaves the table, is at most d'Rabbanan, and it was the Rabbanan that had the ability to decide where and when and how one is going to fulfill their mitzvah. And therefore it makes sense that if one recited Birkas HaMazon intentionally in another location, that the Chachamim imposed a penalty that they would have to return back to the table and bench a second time. And that's the way that we explained the Tur as well. Now, this raises several queries, because then according to Beis Shammai, if a person leaves the table without reciting Birkas HaMazon, and then they realize, and now they have to return back to the table, and this Birkas HaMazon that they will recite is going to be at most a d'Rabbanan, then in a case of Sofek, if they are not sure whether they had recited Birkas HaMazon, and they've already left the table, then this would be a situation of a Sfeika d'Rabbanan L'Kula, where they would not have to return back to the table and bench. What's also necessary to understand is, according to Beis Shammai then, does that mean if somebody leaves the table to, let's say, go to the bathroom or to fetch mayim achronim or to take care of something, and then they return back to the table and then they sit down to bench, does that mean that they have lost the mitzvah d'oraisa? So to answer this, we can explain that the rule according to Beis Shammai is that when a person feels the mental satisfaction of having eaten, when they feel a sensation that they are full and they're happy about it and they're aware that they are relieved, as long as they're experiencing that sensation, then they have the mitzvah d'oraisa to recite Birkas Hamazon. And so if they leave the table momentarily just to fetch something and they return back to the table and they're still experiencing that that mental satisfaction, then indeed they still can fulfill their mitzvah d'oraisa. Now, truth be told, that's very difficult to quantify, and a person really doesn't know themselves if they're still feeling their original sensations when they come back to the table. No one's really in touch with that practically, but it really doesn't make a difference because the halacha is not like Beis Shammai, l'chumra and l'kula. We only take on the chumras of Beis Shammai, but we don't take on the kulas. And by the same token then, according to Beis Shammai, if one left the table without benching and one realized that there was and one was in doubt whether one benched, then indeed that would be a sveika d'Rabbanan, the kula, and one would not have to return back to the table to bench. But we do not hold like that kula. We only hold of the chumras of Beis Shammai, and that one has to return back to the table whether b'shogeg b'mezid. But we would not hold of the leniencies of such that at this point it is only a sveika d'Rabbanan, or have to keep track of what one's feelings are when one comes back to the table, because the baseline halacha is like Beis Hillel, and we hold that as long as the body is satisfied before the bread has digested, as long as the body is satisfied, then one is still incumbent midoraisa to bench, and so therefore we don't have to get into the nuances of what constitutes leaving the table, and also when one is in doubt, a sveika d'oraisa, if one is in doubt whether one is benched, if one is still feeling full, then that's still a sveika d'oraisa l'chumra. There's still a doubt whether one has fulfilled one's mitzvah d'oraisa. So as we said in the shir itself, according to the Ramah brings in a tshuva that we can hold like the chumras of Beis Shammai, but not like the kulas. And over here as well, we would not be privy to the chumras, to the kulas of Beis Shammai at all. And therefore, practically, although we can pose it that Beis Shammai would treat Birkas Hamazon at this stage, after leaving the table, as a D'Rabbanan, and subject to all the leniencies of the D'Rabbanans, nonetheless, that's not how we hold practically. And this would account for the fact that none of the poskim mentioned the need to gauge whether one is still satisfied mentally, and also in a case of doubt, when there's a sofek, both in this siman and in other simanim, none of the poskim holds that if one leaves the table it constitutes a sveika d'Rabbanan l'kula, because none of the poskim hold like Beis Shammai l'kula. We do not consider Beis Shammai's opinion in order to be that lenient. We still hold like Beis Hillel. So it can be understood why the poskim did not mention these leniencies according to Beis Shammai. And if you want to ask, and if you still want to challenge me and say that why did none of the maforshim of the Gemara explain any of these leniencies according to Beis Shammai? Well, firstly, I haven't taken a look at every single maforish on the sugya. One can do one's own research if one wants. But more importantly, the maforshim did not get into the root machloikus between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, and therefore they didn't present any of the findings that we did. That is the first note, just to wrap up the shitta of Beis Shammai. The second point is the shitta of the Rosh. In our last shir, we mentioned that the Rosh held that not only is the bracha after eating bread midoraisa, but also after eating mazonos. And this is based on the Kesef Mishnah at the beginning of Hilchas Brachas. And the Kesef Mishnah derives this from the Rambam. It's not only the Kesef Mishnah, but there are indications in other Rishonim that the bracha over the after bracha of Ala Michya is also min Torah, namely the Meiri and Rבינו Yona. But we do understand that the Beis Yosef himself in the Kesef Mishnah sees the Rosh and maybe even the Rambam as holding that the bracha after eating the zoinus is a mitzvah from the Torah. And so with this in mind, we've explained that the Mechaber holds that when it comes to returning back to the table, in order to recite the after bracha, that it is not only over bread, but it is also after eating mazoinus, which those two being both a Torah obligation. And not only that, but it seems that the Gra, whether he holds like this himself, but he definitely explains the Mechaber to hold this way, because in Siman Kuf Pei Gimel, in Sif Yud, where the Mechaber speaks about which foods one needs to sit for when one reciting their after bracha, he mentions the bracha of Ma'in Shalosh. Now, he doesn't specify whether it's for Mazoinus or for all the Shiva Samidim, but the Gra specifies that it's specifically for Mazoinus, like the Rambam, and based on the Mechaber's view in the Kesef Mishnah. So it seems that it's a given, and we can see a shitta, we can see consistency in the opinion of the Mechaber, who holds that the bracha over Mazoinus is a doraisa as well as bread, and therefore one needs to treat it with the same degree of respect according to Beis Hillel. Now, if that is indeed the case, this would raise a serious question, because we will find that wherever the Mechaber mentions Birkas HaMazon and again Sofek, when in doubt if one has benched or not, then one must bench again, but only for bread, whether it's in our Siman or in Reish Tes, and the Mechaber makes no mention of having to treat Mazoinus the same way as bread. And that raises the question then, if Mazoinus is tantamount to bread, then why doesn't the Mechaber treat it with the same level of stringency as a Sveika Daraisa Lachumra and having to recite Ala Michya in doubt? Now, I'm not going to be able to give a full answer to this, but I will say that I'm not the first one to pick this out. And there are several Achronim who have dealt with the subject, and they're brought in the Stei Chemed, and another one of the Achronim in his Chuvas, Keren David, and I have posted this all in the description if you would like to take a look at these all inside. And the truth is that even if the bracha of Mazoinus is Doraisa, and even with the after bracha of benching itself in cases of doubt, there is a whole discussion amongst the poskim whether it may be an actual sofek, or it may be sveka, or there may be other considerations here. And so, without getting into all of the details, you can take a look at that yourself. It is plausible to say that the bracha of the halachas of sofek and all the nuances would not apply to Mazoinus. If anything, they would apply only to bread itself. Bread, which everyone concurs is an obligation to bench Minat Torah. Mazoinus, here as well, the Mechaber may be taking the Rosh into consideration and treating it as Mazoinus, as a Torah requirement, L'chumra, having to recite the bracha sitting or having to go back to the table. But when it comes to reciting the bracha of Ala Michya in the case of doubt, there we have multiple doubts, because there's a machloikus about Ala Michya. And in fact, most of the Rishonim don't hold that Ala Michya is from the Torah. And given that there's another sofek, and there are other considerations as well, which I'm not going to get into, that is all spelled out in the Stei Chemed. One can take a look at it there. So, for that reason, the Mechaber did not hold that when in doubt, one needs to recite Ala Michya, only Birkas HaMazon itself. Now, the way that we described it in the Shir was that, according to the Gra, we didn't even get into this. The Gra is also Choshesh. He only takes the Rosh into consideration, but he doesn't actually hold like the Rosh. No one held like the Rosh to that degree. And even if the Rosh held like this to begin with, that Mazonis is Doraisa, we read into the Rosh, but not necessarily. So it's a grey area, which is, it's a grey area that we've sort of created. It's not really a grey area. What is given is that we return to the table for bread. Bread is a doraisa, and therefore, in a case of safek, one should go lechumra. The other shiva saminim, ideally, one should make the bracha of ala peiros before one leaves the table. But if not, then one does not have to go back to the table. We do not treat them with that degree of severity, and definitely not a case of safek. Even the Taz, who does hold shiva saminim, are the same as the other as bread. Still, in a case of safek, no one mentioned that one should have to return and that one should have to recite ala peiros in a case of doubt. So with that, we can clearly delineate between the laws of returning back to the table and the laws of actual doraisa, whether it's a sveka doraisa. So with that, we conclude Siman Kuf Pei Daled. The rest of the Siman is about the mitzvah of Birkas HaMazon. That's its own sugya, and it crosses various other simanim. I've mentioned them, and I'm not going to get into that now. At another occasion, we will go into these halachas more fully. But for now, we end Siman Kuf Pei Daled, which was about the need to return to the table in order to recite Birkas HaMazon at the table, whether it's Shoigeg or Mezid, who holds what, and whether it's a Knas or whether it's a Gzeira. We will now move on to the next Siman, Kuf Ayin Ches, although chronologically it comes before Siman Kuf Pei Daled, but nonetheless it builds on what we have just been discussing now in Kuf Pei Daled, and therefore we move on to the next playlist, which will be Siman Kuf Ayin Ches.